Hello everyone, welcome back to this final part of this final lecture in our lecture series of Finance2. And here we're going to talk about another way to manage interest rate risk, namely through interest rate swaps. So why talk about interest rate swaps? Well, first of all, they're a way to manage risk. And second of all, they are so important in the derivatives market. So I've shown you this picture before. Where there's this graph by the Bank for International Settlements that shows how big is the market for certain derivatives in terms of the value of the underlying. And it turns out that the interest rate derivatives, they simply dwarf all the other derivatives. So maybe that's a useful thing to talk about, at least for a little bit. So what is an interest rate swap? Well, it's all in the name, the swapping of two interest rates. And then of course you're going to ask, but why would that matter? Who would ever want to do that? So for instance, why would I ever exchange a loan with an interest rate of 4% for a loan with an interest rate of 3%? Well, you wouldn't do that. But what typically ends up happening is that fixed rates are exchanged for floating rates. And so one party agrees to pay a certain fixed rate, one party agrees, and the other party says, that's great, then in return I'll give you floating rates. So fixed rates, pretty easy type of contract. If you have an interest rate of, for instance, 4%, then you expect coupon payments of 4% on that contract for as long as it goes. Floating rate contracts are typically based on some underlying market interest rate. So very common one, the London Interbank offered rate. So for instance, for the LIBOR, you simply look at what was the LIBOR over the last 6 months. Then I'll base my payment on this loan on this LIBOR. And of course, this LIBOR can change over time. The rate then becomes floating. So how does this work in practice then? How much cash is exchanged? Well, what you do for these interest rate swap contracts is you simply calculate, hey, what is the payment on the fixed contract? What is the payment on the floating contract? Take the difference between the two and then pay the difference to the party that is owed the difference. So as an example, let's take an example from the book. So suppose we have this 5-year $100 million interest rate swap, 7.8% fixed rate, and then let's exchange it for a LIBOR based floating rate. So if we have this $100 million interest rate, $100 million bond with 7.8% fixed rate that's paid semi-annually, that means that every half year I would expect half of the 7.8%, so $3.9 million. For the LIBOR one, it would be based on what was the LIBOR over the last half year. So if I then look at this table from the book, well, for the fixed coupons, those are going to be the same for every period. And then if over the last 6 months I had annualized LIBOR of about 6.8%, then that means that my floating rate coupon here is going to be 0.5 times this 6.8, here 0.5 times 7.2. And then simply look for the difference. So here the fixed coupon gives 3.9, the floating rate coupon gets 3.4. So if I'm the person in the contract that said, hey, I'm going to exchange my fixed coupon for your floating rate coupon, then you have to pay them 0.5. So you simply pay them the difference. Note that the one thing about these swap-based contracts is that the face value in this contract is never paid. So there is an underlying face value that is used to calculate what the interest rate payments are. This is called a so-called notional principal, but it's never exchanged. It also wouldn't be very interesting to exchange it because, well, you're simply exchanging 100 or face value of 100 for a face value of 100. So what's going on there? But in principle, these face values, the underlying value of the thing that interest is paid on, is never exchanged. So why is swap-based hedging useful? Well, firms often do it. They often combine swaps with standard loans. And that is because, well, if you think about it, the interest rate that firms pay essentially boils down to two factors. So the first is, what is the interest rate right now? The second is, what is the spread that the firm needs to pay on the interest rate? So how risky is this firm and what does this mean for how much it has to pay on this loan. So, and of course, both of these factors can change over time. So if the interest rate for a firm changes, that can be because the interest rate in the market as a whole has gone up or down, or because the firm's credit quality has changed over time. And by engaging in swaps together with standard loans, you can kind of isolate these effects and choose which risk you do want to bear and which risk you do not want to bear. So to make this a little bit more concrete, let's look at the example from the book where we have this company ACC. It needs to borrow 10 million to fund an expansion, and it can do so either through a floating rate LIBOR contract or a fixed rate contract. Current 6-month LIBOR is 4%, and the 10-year interest rate is 6%. And then on both, this firm is a little bit risky, so it needs to pay a spread of 1 percentage point. So what can it more or less do? Well, it can either engage in this long-term loan of 10 years and then pay 7%, or borrow for only 6 months, but then after 6 months, of course, they have to repay the debt, so they need to roll it over, they need to find someone new to borrow from, and then borrow at the new interest rate. What would that mean for them? So if they're borrowing long term, they're paying 7%, no questions asked, all fine and dandy. And if they're borrowing short term, well, then their interest rate floats. So what happens? Well, first of all, the interest rate itself, so the London and so the LIBOR can change, but also their credit quality here by delta can also change. What's nice about borrowing for the long term? Well, if interest rates are currently very low, then you can lock them in, but if your spread is currently very high, then you're also locking that in. You can also say here that the pro here is if delta is low, then you also lock that in. And here, if the interest rate is high, then you also lock that in. Because, well, interest rates can of course go up or down. And then the pro of borrowing short term is that, hey, if this company, as is stated in the book, believes that their credit quality will improve over time, then they assume that, hey, this delta will go down over time, so that eventually we'll get some benefit of better credit quality, which translates into lower rates. But then, of course, you still have the risk that the rates in the economy as a whole, that they increase. So what do you do then? So what if you want to isolate this effect? So you do want to bear the risk of your credit quality improving or declining, but you do not want to bear the risk of the interest rate going up or down. And that's the case in the book, because this company says, hey, interest rates in the market as a whole are low right now, so I want to lock those in. But my credit quality is bad right now, so I do not want to lock that in. Well, what can it do? What it can do is borrow this 10 million using a short-term loan, and then engage in a swap contract. So what type of swap contract would it enter into? Well, if it agrees to pay a fixed rate per year in exchange for receiving the floating rate, then essentially what they're doing is they're paying a fixed rate, they're receiving this floating rate, and they can use that floating rate to repay the debt that they're constantly rolling over. So what would that mean? What would they need to pay each period? Well, first of all, so they borrowed this short term, they borrowed short term, so they need to pay this R plus delta. Then they said, well, we're engaged in this fixed rate in this fixed rate swap, so we're paying this counterparty to the swap this 6%. So this goes to the counterparty. So that's what I'm paying each period. I'm paying back my short-term loan, and I'm paying this counterparty in which I engaged in this fixed rate swap. But then in exchange from the counterparty, so again from this counterparty, I'm receiving this floating rate that I'm getting from the swap. So this means that this short-term loan rate that fluctuates over time that I'm paying each period cancels out against the floating rate that I'm receiving from the swap. So each period I'm getting that floating rate, I'm simply passing that on to the bank or whomever I borrowed short term from. And that means that in the end my net borrowing cost is this low fixed interest rate plus this credit quality, which I hope declines over time. So essentially I'm isolating the risk from the interest rate in the economy as a whole, which I'm not bearing, because for that I'm using this fixed rate contract for which I've engaged in a swap with. And I've isolated also this change in credit quality, for which I do want to bear the risk, because I think it will go down over time. So this is kind of a nice way to isolate those two effects. What you can also do with swaps is change duration. So typically what you want to do if you want to engage, so for instance, let's go back to the example we used before. So let's see, yeah, I don't have it here, but the example we used before, we kind of want to lower the duration of our assets. So what we want to do is engage in swaps in which we agree to pay a certain fixed payment and in return get a floating payment. So because these fixed payments, so for instance on our mortgages we receive these fixed payments, so these fluctuate a lot. Well, when the value of these fluctuate a lot when the interest rate changes. So we kind of want to get rid of those fixed payments. So we get engaged in a contract in which we pay fixed payments and in return receive these floating rate payments. And because these floating rate payments, they increase and decrease with the interest rate itself, they are kind of immunized against changes in the interest rate. How much should we exchange? Well, use the same formula as before. Check the example in the book, but in principle this is the exact same thing, where you simply look for, hey, what is the change in the portfolio duration that I need? What is the portfolio value? And what is the change in, what is the difference between the duration in the floating and the fixed rate contract? And that should give you a pretty good idea of how much you should exchange. But it's the same exact idea as we saw in the duration-based hedging. So today we talked about interest rates, we talked about zero coupon bonds, the yield curve, how to get it from that, and we talked about duration. So important for today is that interest rate risk is this important determinant. It's important for everyone, and you can hedge against it by engaging, for instance, in swaps or by selling and buying assets. And then engaging in swaps has the advantage over selling or buying assets that you do not need to sell or buy your assets. So maybe as a bank you do not want to do that because you're kind of happy with your portfolio, but you do want to immunize yourself against duration-based risk, and then swap can be a very useful way to isolate this risk. Alright guys, that's it for me and for this entire lecture series. I hope you had fun. I am very tired after all this speaking in my webcam. I'm sure my webcam is tired as well, so maybe I should give it a name someday. And I'm sure that you guys are tired as well, but hopefully you stuck with me. And it was at least a little bit of fun for you, or if it's not fun, then at least you hopefully learned something. And if you didn't learn something, well then hopefully at least you get a good grade on the exam. Although I hope that there is a high correlation between learning something and doing well on the exam. Let's hope that works out. So thanks for sticking with me all this time. Good luck on the exam, everyone, and maybe I'll see you somewhere in the future in our Finance Master. See you there. Bye, guys.